Book 3, Chapter 6 of The Position of Peggy Harper by Leonard Merrick. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Another of the phrases that commended themselves to her taste was "that sort of thing," as a label for the class of dramatic entertainment with which she had hitherto been associated. "That sort of thing" was eloquent of immeasurable space between the speaker and the disparaging depths. She was aware, with discomfiture, that her future husband was, conspicuously, a creator of "that sort of thing." When, by a passing reference, his melodrama was scoffed at in the dressing room one night, "London inside out and that sort of thing," she did not say, "I'm engaged to Mr. Tatham." She went on pencilling her scanty eyebrows in simulated unconcern. Of course, she meant to marry poor old Chris; that she should ever marry anybody else after all these years was unthinkable. But, for mother's sake, she suggested to him that the wedding should be postponed until Christmas. She explained with a kiss that, for her to clear out and get married the moment her luck had turned would be awfully rough on poor old mother. And for another thing, the run of Forsyth's piece was coming to an untimely end, and it was more than likely that in August she would be up to her eyes in the rehearsals of her new part. "It would be a fearful muddle to get married at the same time." There was no longer any allusion between her and Tatham to her leaving the stage. She was now in a position to demand a large salary, and considering the dimensions of his own, he could not dwell on his wish that she should sacrifice the prospect. Already it was manifest to him that her mother's prediction was to be fulfilled. He would be "the husband of Miss Peggy Harper." His assent to the proposal that he should possess his soul in patience until Christmas was forthcoming with such readiness that, if the girl's new egotism had been less prodigious, she would have been wounded in the perception that she was undesired. They had discussed the matter at the window in Liverpool Road. Beneath them, Islingtonians passed stiffly in their Sunday black, and in the bedroom Mrs. Harper was taking a siesta. Peggy's spirits had risen; she was feeling much tenderer towards "poor old Chris," now that she was not to marry him so soon. She forsook her chair for his knee, and thought what a good fellow he was, and that it was an awful pity that he wasn't cleverer. As often as she laid her artificialities aside and was once more the outspoken little gamine that he had known, it was easier for him to fondle her. A tepid affection, stimulated by gratitude for the unexpected respite that she had afforded him, was animating conversation gaily when she exclaimed, with a sudden change of tone, "Oh, bother, I forgot! Naomi Knight's coming in this afternoon. I do think that every duffer I've ever met in the profession has worried me to find an engagement for her since I've been at the Pig." Mentally, the girl on his knee was all at once 1,000 leagues from him. "You used to be such pals with Naomi," he remonstrated. "Oh, my dear boy!" She had her stuffy stop out again. "I like Naomi very well, but how can I take the responsibility of recommending a woman like that? She's not an artist." "She's not inspired," admitted Tatham, "but not many of them are. What is it she wants you to do?" "Oh, the piece will be going out in the autumn. She wants me to get her into the tour. She wants me to speak to Onslow for her. She wrote that she'd be thankful for anything, even for half a dozen lines. I believe she's in Queer Street. It's all very well," she wrinkled her forehead and shrugged one shoulder. "In my position one can't do these things. I mean to say, how can I advise Onslow or W.B. to take Naomi Knight?" "I should have thought she could have played a small part quite as well as anybody else they're likely to get for the money," he said dryly. "She's had plenty of experience." "Not in pieces like this. She hasn't the finish. They'll want it played in the same tone on the road as it's played at the Pig. Her manner's not West End enough. I mean to say, Naomi's all right in the No. 2 towns and that sort of thing, but she hasn't got the style for first-class companies. It's a very difficult thing to say to her, of course, but—" Her critical head was shaken ponderously. "It's astonishing she doesn't see it for herself. 'Pon my word, it's extraordinary, the kind of people that go into the profession. The more one sees of it, the more extraordinary it is." When Naomi Knight arrived, a sadder and shabbier figure than when he had last met her, after the greetings had been exchanged and the feigned cheerfulness of the first few minutes was past, it was painful to Tatham to feel how sensitive the woman was to the girl's professional distance from her now. She had no hesitation in unveiling her necessities before him, and as she said deprecatingly, conscious of the suppliant's embarrassment, how grateful she would be if Peggy would put in a word for her, his thoughts flashed back to the lodging over the dairy and refreshment rooms, where they used to call each other "Ducky" and "Romp." She was a mediocre actress, but she loved her calling, loved it with her heart and her brain, and she was no longer young. When she explained that unless it yielded a pittance to her shortly, she would have to give it up and go in for something else, her recognition of the fact that her life had been a failure was not without pathos. She spoke vaguely of typewriting or of dressmaking. Though it appeared to him that it would be far wiser for her to quit the stage than to persist in the struggle to sustain a hand-to-mouth existence on it, she shrank from the final relinquishment of hope so pitiably that the arrogance of the girl's attitude towards her jarred him as inhuman. Peggy had not the faintest idea that she was being inhuman. Nothing was further from her thoughts than to be or to sound unkind. She was merely actuated by a desire to parade her position, lest the other might fail to apprehend its splendours to the full. But every note in her voice was offensive, and the girl who had once boasted that she never forgot a pal, talked to the woman as she might have talked to a child. "Well, as you ask my opinion," she said, although it was not her opinion that had been asked, but her help, "I'd strongly advise you to go in for anything you can. Typewriting, dressmaking, whatever it is. I mean to say, supposing I did go to Onslow and say, 'Look here, you've got to do this for me. She's a friend of mine. On the rocks, and she'll be all right in the part.' Supposing I did do it, what'd it amount to? What's the use of just one engagement? It wouldn't be a long one either. I mean to say, the only business the piece'll do will be in the No. 1 towns. It won't play to the gas in the places where they're used to rough and tumble melodrama and that sort of thing. It'll be quite over their heads. It's much too clever and zoological. I see a very short tour for it. A very short tour. I told W.B. so frankly the other day. Well, in 2 or 3 months you'd be on your uppers again. I mean to say, one can't I couldn't keep on. I tell you honestly, my dear girl, I don't see any future for you in the profession. To make anything like a position to day is most enormously difficult. You haven't a notion what hundreds of women there are, clever women too in their way, who'll never do any good." "Haven't I?" muttered Naomi. "I tell you what it is, to come to the front on the stage to day, a girl has got to be something quite out of the common. They want a lot, there's no doubt about it. There's so much ordinary talent knocking around that for a girl to come to the front to day, she's got to be different to anybody else. She's got to be able to—" "She wasn't talking about coming to the front," interrupted Tatham hotly. "She'd be satisfied with a couple of pounds a week to go on with, wouldn't you, Miss Knight?" "I'd take 25 shillings," said the woman. Peggy's gesture was intolerant. "And that's just where it is. The profession's chock-a-block with actresses who are good enough for 25 shillings a week. They're the most difficult people in the world to do anything for." "I see your point," said Naomi bitterly. "I'm sorry I bothered you. It isn't always the geniuses that get to the front, though," she added, turning to Tatham. "A good many rotters get there, and a good many clever girls are too poor to afford to die in a sanatorium. You saw Elsie Lane was dead?" He had not seen it. He gazed at her, startled. "It's in the Referee. Of course, she'd been ill for years. Consumption. I heard a little while ago she was starving. She tried as long as she could to hide how ill she was, but they say she looked so dreadful towards the end that she couldn't get an engagement at any money." "Is that so?" he murmured. The poignancy of it pierced him no less keenly because the tragedy was told in the hard, careless tones of a woman quivering under her own humiliation. He remembered his last glimpse of Elsie Lane, and cursed himself that he hadn't spoken to her. As vivid as his view of it in the Strand was his memory of the sick girl's painted face, painted, as he understood now, to mask the ravages of disease and enable her to earn her bread in the theatre. Farther back he looked, into a town whose name he had forgotten, and walked beside her through white, empty streets, and stood wishing her luck on a doorstep. "There's a mention of me again in the Ref," said Peggy, displaying a copy of the paper languidly. She pointed to a line in the answers to correspondence. "Seen this, Naomi? Student of the drama. Miss Peggy Harper's favourite flower is the lily of the valley." End of chapter 6 of book 3. Book 3, chapter 7 of The Position of Peggy Harper by Leonard Merrick. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. When Theodosia told Tatham that she would like to retain the copy of Shams for a little while longer, she had said it with an audacious project in her mind, and what passed between them subsequently modified but did not annul the plan. She no longer dreamt of the delight of asking him to come to see her and proclaiming that a distinguished dramatic critic thought highly of his comedy, but she did continue to think of begging a distinguished critic to read it, and to scribble an encouraging line on the subject if he found the comedy as meritorious as she expected him to do. Pritchard did not go to the Aspect office very often, and she had not been presented to him until she had been on the staff for 2 or 3 months. Since then she had seen him several times. More than once he had sat on a table and talked to her. It was occasionally difficult to associate his diatribes on the paper with his simplicity on the table, and she did not think the amiable authority would refuse her petition if she showed herself conscious of asking a very great favour. An opportunity for asking it was slow to arrive, but he did not refuse. Indeed, he consented at once, because he was under the impression that the play of her preamble had been written by herself. When she haltingly explained that it was by the author of London Inside Out, however, she became distressfully aware of a light of amusement in Mr. Pritchard's eyes. "You aren't going to be prejudiced against it, Mr. Pritchard?" she pleaded. "This is the man's real work, the kind of work he wants to do and always has done, excepting in that one wretched case. If I'd had the courage, I'd have scratched his name off it before I showed it to you. Do read it." She blundered to a breakdown. "Fairly?" He peered at her with a wry smile. "I wasn't going to say fairly," she stammered. "I was going to say attentively." "I'll read it quite attentively enough to form an opinion," he promised her. "That's all right. But it won't advance Mr. Tatham in the slightest degree, you know, if I like it." An undesigned inflection apprised her that few things were more improbable to his mind than that he would like it, and, as a matter of fact, his interest had abated so much that in the course of half an hour the rôle that he was carrying was an object of aversion to him. Many weeks passed before she heard his verdict, and her expectations had subsided considerably in the meanwhile. "Well, I've read your friend's play, Miss Moore," he announced hesitatingly. "I can't say I think he has treated his subject in the happiest way." So much for her hope. She faltered, "Oh?" "I think it was bad judgment to make his hero a writing man. Why a writing man? Hasn't Mr. Tatham heard of politicians, or inventors, or manufacturers, or engineers, or men in any other walk of life outside the arts? His purpose in Shams is to present an interesting study of a man's struggles to get on, and he puts the man in a profession that doesn't interest the public in the least. Short-sighted. To choose an author as the protagonist of an English play, or of an English novel, is to handicap the thing from the word go. No writer who knew his business would do it. What do you suppose the public care about somebody's difficulties in placing his manuscripts? If a dramatist or a novelist aims at awakening interest in the study of a career, it's folly for him to choose an artistic career. We aren't in France. In France it's done again and again, but in the land of good art and bad smells, the public's tastes are infinitely better, and infinitely worse, than ours. Of course, the French talk a very great deal more about les économies than about les arts, but for all that, above the level of Apaches, Frenchmen who don't take any interest whatever in art and literature are even scarcer than Englishmen who do. Mr. Tatham's a very acute observer. I'm surprised he doesn't recognise the limitations of the audience he's writing for." "Oh, do you think he shows observation?" she said eagerly. "You don't think his work is— You find something to say for it, then?" "I think very highly of his work," replied Pritchard in a key of protest, as if he had said so already. "I think he lacks one very desirable quality. When I say desirable, I mean desirable for long runs. He lacks the so-called optimism that's always popular. He shows afflictions to be afflictions, instead of representing them as ultimate boons. If a nurse girl went mad and cut the baby's throat in a play of Mr. Tatham's, we shouldn't be told at the end that the baby's parents and nurse girls were filled with the peace of perceiving that all things worked mysteriously for some great and illuminative blessing. That's a mistake, commercially. No bland lie can be too preposterous to win wide approval. Say black is rose colour. Millions will smack their lips over the statement and call the man who questions it a pessimist. The national definition of a pessimist is one who faces unwelcome facts. Pessimist and optimist are the two most misused words in the English language. And of course Shams hasn't any titled personages in it. If Mr. Tatham always writes about the middle classes, I'm afraid he'll find that another commercial drawback." "You are," faltered the girl, with more pride and happiness than she dared to show, "taking Mr. Tatham very seriously, aren't you?" "Certainly I'm taking him very seriously. I'm bound to say I don't foresee his making a fortune in the theatre, though even that's largely a matter of luck, but I think he ought to make a big reputation. I want to send Shams to Onslow. I was talking to him about it the other day, and he said he'd like to consider it." "Oh!" she gasped. "But Mr. Onslow refused it as unsuitable months ago." "That's irrelevant," said Pritchard. "This time he's going to read it. Of course he mayn't see any money in it, but if Onslow doesn't feel inclined to risk a production of it, it ought to be shown to somebody else. I'd like to see Shams get a chance somewhere. And anyhow," he added, "I think that he'll be quite sure to read anything that Mr. Tatham sends to him in future." End of Chapter 7 of Book 3. Book 3, Chapter 8 of The Position of Peggy Harper by Leonard Merrick. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. But as Theodosia felt that Tatham had made it impossible for her to correspond with him, and as it was equally out of the question for her to suggest to Mr. Pritchard that he should do more than he had generously done, the author of Shams remained unaware that his prospects had an upward tendency. In this his position differed widely from that of Peggy, who was conscious of being more valuable every day. Her anticipations had been realised. Soon after she left the Piccadilly she had been offered an engagement at the Waterloo, and had asked for a contract at £50 a week, and got it. She was not performing in the new part with so much seeming intelligence as she had performed in the part of Daphne, because the instruction afforded to her at the Waterloo, though patient and painstaking, had lacked the quality of inspiration, but she reproduced Forsyth's fetching and natural smile with a tilted chin and her hands behind her back, and playgoers, having accepted her as delightful, continued to admire her. The management found it financially sound to put 10 £5 notes in an envelope every week for a girl who, troublesome though she was to teach, had the adherence of the press and public. Subsequent managements were equally complacent when she acquired the nerve to demand £75 and 100. In the occupation which is given the most publicity, the calling in which an artist like Elsie Lane had suffered in want and died in squalor, this puppet had despotically arrived. And already the blare of the trumpets was duller to her ears. Already she regarded homage as her birthright. She no longer enjoyed ecstatically, and wished, like a precocious child, that her delight were less. That childish wish had been the final impulse of a moribund simplicity. Keenly now she was alive to nothing but the immensity of her consequence in the social scheme. Diligently as she dwelled on every word of a complimentary criticism, she read the compliment, not with gratitude, but with a sense of her incomparable superiority to the scribes who praised her. If she knew nothing else about them, she knew that they were very poorly paid. Intellect impressed her not at all. Fame itself, other than histrionic fame, meant nothing to her. By this time the eminent men who had had the curiosity to approach her were fairly numerous, and their celebrity had not abashed her in the least. She too could boast celebrity, and as to the value of their achievements, she was too ignorant to be aware of it. She chatted to an R.A. and a cabinet minister with an unrestraint tinged by condescension. To an illustrious man of letters, whose name she had never heard before, she was rather rude. It was not the girl's fault. She had been a good-natured, unpretentious little Cockney with a warm heart. It was the fault of the cabinet minister, the R.A., and the man of letters, of their wives and their daughters, and of a press that pandered to an idolatry which it privately condemned. It was the fault, in fine, of the age in which she lived. Truly she believed, and London had conspired to persuade her, that the world of the theatre was the most important under heaven. Truly she believed that she shone effulgent in it by right of genius. She could not escape the reflection that when she married a clerk she would be committing an act of sensational self-sacrifice. Alternately she was proud to think how generous she was, and surprised that poor old Chris didn't see for himself that it "wouldn't do." To be sure, he had intimated something of the sort when she told him that her salary was to be £50 a week, but he had allowed her to talk him over. In looking back, she was inclined to blame him for that, forgetting the nature of the protests she had made. If she were a man, she didn't think she'd find it good enough. But of course Chris was weak. If he hadn't been weak, would he have stuck in a clerkship all these years? Since he couldn't write plays, he should have done something else. What course had been open to him, she did not profess to decide, but he should have buckled to. A concomitant of her inordinate self-esteem was, naturally, a lofty intolerance of failure. She developed with rapidity an intolerance of many things, of restaurants that were not quite the smartest, and of any champagne that wasn't the only one worth drinking, though, of a truth, she could discover no difference between that and others, excepting under the prices on the wine list. Presents and invitations lost their novelty, and the chit who had felt important at the sight of a Clapham waiter opening her bottle of beer, was now airily familiar with what she called the menu of the Savoy. Not long since introduced to her first liqueur, she asserted listlessly that she always took green chartreuse. She developed the habit of being late for appointments, when she contrived to remember them at all. Twice she had arranged with Tatham to meet her at the stage door, and dismissed him after he had waited for 25 minutes in a draught, with the hurried explanation that some people had asked her to supper. But when, raging, he broke the engagement off, her better self or her vanity was wounded, and she did not approve his independence after all. Having cried and sulked for a week, she sent a little penitent letter to him, which made him feel that he was a brute for returning to her unwillingly. It was about a fortnight after the reconciliation that one day, when he went to her in Keppel Street (Liverpool Road had been abandoned), he found her very natural and meek. She was nibbling a pencil forlornly and struggling to write a description of her histrionic methods. "Oh, I say," she exclaimed, "I am glad you've come in. I was going to drop you a postcard. I don't know how to do this beastly thing." He learned that she had been petitioned to contribute to a series of articles that was appearing in The Beholder under the heading "How I Study a Part." In the present emergency her mother had proved useless, and the sight of a copy of the paper in which 2 columns of twaddle had been written, or signed, by Miss Clytie Pateward had increased her eagerness to figure in the series herself. "Do you see?" she said. "I'd have my photo in the middle, and my name printed 3 times. It'd been an awful pity to miss the ad. You might think of something for me, Chris. Have a cig and tell me what to say." "What have you said?" he asked. "How have you begun?" "I've only done a little bit. I study a part by first learning the lines, and then I work them up. That's all I've written so far." "That isn't much, is it?" "Well, I don't know any more to say about it," she said fretfully. "I'm sick of the job. I've been sitting here for an hour. I can't make out how Pateward's written such a lot. I've read it twice, but I can't say the same things that she does. I don't know what they've sent the rotten thing to me for. It's no help to me. Lot of flap, just to show how clever she is." "That's what you've got to do." "Well, I know all about that, but I'm an actress, I'm not an authoress. You might cut in and be useful," she coaxed. "Of course I will," he said readily. "I'm no good at it either, but I'll do all I can. Tell me how you do study a part, then we'll make something of it between us. We'll try to dress it up and make it sound pretty." She regarded him open-mouthed, and her gaze wandered. For a cold, disquieting moment she realised that the way she studied a part was to do in it exactly as she was told. For a moment only. There were some things too to be expressed. "Oh well," she faltered, "I don't know just what I do. Look what my notices say." He nodded. He understood her better than her critics did. "I suppose," he sighed, "that you might say that when you get a new part you lie awake all night thinking about it." "Oh yes," she agreed. "That's it." She licked the pencil. "I study a part by first learning the lines, and then I work them up, and then I lie awake all night. No, that doesn't sound right. Oh, I say, do come on. It's giving me the hump." "I should begin differently. I should say that when a part is first handed to you, you feel you feel awfully shy." "Shy?" "Yes, shy. You feel awfully shy, as if it were a stranger that you'd got to make friends with." "Do you think I ought to feel shy?" she demurred. "Yes, yes," he said impatiently. "It's going to show how clever you are directly. You feel awfully shy, as if it were a stranger that you had to make friends with, and then, by degrees, you forget that it's a part, you seem to be speaking your own thoughts. In fact, you're not quite sure on the first night whether you're Peggy Harper or the girl in the play. They'll lap that up." "Yes, that's the ticket," she said. She scribbled for a few seconds and contemplated a tangled sentence hopelessly. "But which way do I start? Oh!" She flung the pencil in a tantrum across the room. "Let it rip. 'Tis a shame, 'tis a shame. You might do it for me. Can't you do it for me, Chris? Do it at home for me, there's a dear. Do it for me at home and bring it to me on Sunday. Do it for me by Sunday, and then you can come and read me what you've done. Won't you? I'd like to be in the Beholder. Do write it at home for me, Chris, there's a good chap." It was an easy matter to offer a suggestion, but a more difficult one to produce an article, which was the reason why very little of the nonsense in the How I Study a Part series was written by the actors and actresses themselves. But by dint of taking a good deal of pains, since he was not a journalist, Tatham succeeded in producing that article by Miss Peggy Harper, which shed pleasure in so many English homes. He even took considerable interest in accomplishing it, although he was writing with his tongue in his cheek. Perhaps less for Peggy's sake than to humour his own taste, he sought to make this contribution the best that the series would contain. He toned down statements which on second thoughts appeared conceited. He invented emotions for her and then deleted them. His efforts to steer a middle course between the egotistical and the colourless delayed him vastly. But when he had finished fabricating her ingenious confidences to the public, she sounded a little darling. Her sweet simplicity was as delightful as her brilliant gifts. It was not without a glow of satisfaction that he bore his work to her on Sunday. A postcard urging him to come to middle-day dinner, and to "bring that thing with him," had reached him the previous afternoon, and he had replied by telegram that he wouldn't fail. A taxi cab was waiting before the house, and the sitting room was empty when he entered it. But he heard her voice and her mother's behind the folding doors. Peggy came in swiftly. She had on a hat, and was plainly pressed for time. Her white blouse, fastened at the throat with a brooch depicting a couple of tennis rackets, was sprinkled with various bits of cheap jewellery which her means had permitted her recently to acquire. Under the rackets, a wishbone, a turquoise horseshoe, and a bedizened safety pin were followed by a pendant proclaiming that her Christian name began with a P. Westward a watch hung. To the northeast a silver insect with amethyst wings would have been solitary but for a chaste design set with fine quality pearls at £1 10s. A yard or two of chain encircling her neck became a loop line to a true lover's knot of red enamel before its terminus in a bunch of charms at her waist. "Oh, I say, I'm awfully sorry, but I've got to go out," she said carelessly. "Mother's not going, you'll stop just the same." Her glance fell on the article. "Is that it? I haven't got time to look at it now, I must bolt." By the whitening of his face it was revealed to her that he was very angry. To justify herself, she explained with a quick frown: "I'm going to lunch with Dicker, the airman." "Dicker be damned," said Tatham quietly. "Where you're concerned, I don't play second fiddle to Dicker or anyone else. I'm tired of it. I thought we'd settled all this once and for all." "Yes, well, I've changed my mind," she said. "I haven't changed mine," said he. "Think I'm going to let everything slide to please you?" Her voice was high. "I've got something else to think about, I give you my word. What next? One'd think you were I don't know what." Something, the protrusion of a surly mouth, the timbre of the coarse defiance, jerked his remembrance to an afternoon where their mother had reviled him. "I'm the man you're engaged to marry, and while we are engaged you've got to count me first. If that isn't good enough, the engagement isn't good enough." "Good enough?" she cried derisively. "Crumbs! Don't make me laugh. I've got a cracked lip." After a moment Tatham said, trembling: "You'd better make haste. Your taxi's outside, ticking away twopences." Behind the folding doors, which had been imperfectly closed, Betsy Harper sat rocking with pleasure on a trunk. End of Chapter 8 of Book 3. Book 3, Chapter 9 of The Position of Peggy Harper by Leonard Merrick. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. In the sunlight of a morning 4 years later, Christopher Tatham was absorbed by the task of transferring lobelia from the pots in which it had arrived to the soil of a circular flower bed. and the earth smelled good to him. It was one of those fair, elusive mornings when the garden of a semi-detached villa is not one rod, pole or perch smaller than the imagination of the tenant, and the labourer was feeling that his limited lawn extended as far as the heart of nature. It was one of those mornings when the suburban householder bustles for his train with a wistful glance at the verdure behind his gate, and the author, whose breakfast-room window had afforded a view of neighbours bustling for their trains, paused in his occupation of planting lobelia to realise anew that he need never go to the city any more. The thought was wonderfully arresting, and the flower-pots lay neglected. "Slacking?" laughed Theodosia. She herself was very indolent, in a basket chair under a laburnum tree, with an illustrated paper on her lap. "There are some sugar plums for you in this week's number," she said, "and there's a picture of a lady you used to know." "Theo, something's happened. I need never go to the city any more." "That's lovely," she smiled. "When did you find it out? Today or 3 years ago?" "Just this minute. All over again." Her gaze deepened. He loitered closer to her. "I believe you'd rather have been a gardener than anything else," she told him. "Oh, writing's not bad sometimes. You don't care for it as you did." She reflected. "I've so much else to care for now," she explained happily. "I wonder if he'll write," said Tatham. "I don't want him to." "I don't know what I want Baby to be." "Not a writing man. We shall soon have to leave off calling him Baby, shan't we?" "Oh, there's time enough," she cooed. "I shouldn't like the Bar for him," declared the father, after a pause, remembering his own father. "Nor the Church," said she, thinking of hers. "I don't know why you should mind his writing, though. You've nothing to complain now, unless you're eager for thousands a year." "I don't know that thousands a year are very necessary," he murmured. "You and he, that's the kind of thing that really matters to a man. I've everything I want. Show me the sugar plums in the paper. I'm always grateful for my sugar plums." "Look at the picture first," she said. It was a picture of a girl in a reefer and a pilot cap, smiling, with a tilted chin, and her hands behind her back. Under it was printed: "Miss Peggy Harper, whose engagement to Lord Capenhurst was recently announced. Like her fiancé, Miss Harper has always been devoted to yachting." "It's a funny world," said Tatham thoughtfully. For a space they were silent, looking back, marvelling at the minuteness of big things past. The strangeness of their being here together swayed them both. For an instant the suburban garden held all the mystery of life. Both reviewed a love that had been an exquisite illusion. The man was conscious that the woman by his side was far removed from the girl whom he had idealised. The woman knew that her husband was a world away from the lover of whom she used to dream. In the contentment of a perfect understanding, they turned to each other and their hands touched. "Hark!" he exclaimed, alarmed. "He's crying," gasped Theodosia. The paper fell on the grass as they ran upstairs to Baby. The End. End of Chapter 9 of Book 3. End of The Position of Peggy Harper by Leonard Merrick. Recording by Anna Simon. Nijmegen, the Netherlands, 2017.